Indiana University Cinema's virtual screening room. My name is John Vickers, founding director of IU Cinema, and thank you for being here for tonight's screening of Vitalina Varela from 2019 and former IU Cinema guest, Pedro Costa. Tonight's film was scheduled to be in IU Cinema starting April 26th. The program was supported by the Paula W. Sunderman International Film Fund. Thank you, Paula. We hope that you're all staying healthy and well. We miss seeing you in person in IU Cinema's lobby, and we look forward to that once again. In the meantime, be well. Tonight will be our first interactive experience in our virtual screening room. We are joined by Darlene Sadlier, who will introduce the film and come back after the screening for a post-film conversation. There will be an opportunity to post questions and comments about the film directly with both Darlene and myself. Before I introduce Darlene, please let me mention that next week we'll be having an interactive conversation with actor and IU alumnus Jonathan Banks on Thursday, April 9th at 7 p.m. So we hope you can join us for that as well. Now, Darlene Sadlier is the perfect person for us to speak with before and after a Pedro Costa film. She's the author of several books, including Brazil Imagined, 1500 to Present, Americans All, Good Neighbor and Cultural Diplomacy in World War II, The Portuguese-Speaking Diaspora, 7 Centuries of Literature and the Arts, and the recent IU bicentennial book, Lilly Library from A to Z. She's also a professor emerita in Spanish and Portuguese here at Indiana University and a socio-correspondent at the Brazilian Academy of Letters. Her new book titled Brazilian Documentary Film will be published in 2021. In addition to all this, she was the driving force behind bringing Pedro Costa to IU Cinema in 2011 and was intimately involved in his visit. She's maintained correspondence with the director over the years and knows his work better than anyone in Indiana. So please welcome our good friend, Darlene Sadlier.
Thank you very much, John. It's great to see you, and I really am delighted to be introducing Pedro Costa's new film, Vitalina Varela. I thought it might be helpful for those new to Costa's films to talk a little bit about the context for the movie they are going to see. Costa's films are about a wave of migration in the early 1960s from Cape Verde, which is an archipelago off the western coast of Africa, to Portugal. At the time, Cape Verde was part of a dwindling Portuguese empire that still included large parts of Africa, such as Angola and Mozambique. Portugal was suffering a labor shortage because of incentives that drew its workers to different parts of Europe and the US. Portugal was also sending its young men to fight in the colonial wars in Africa that began in 1961 and continued until the revolution in 1974. The depressed economic situation in Cape Verde was also a driving force for a mostly male, dark-skinned, poorly educated and unskilled workforce to leave the archipelago for Lisbon. There they were mostly hired for heavy construction jobs, which included building the Carlos Gulbenkian Foundation, which perhaps some of your viewers may know. Migrants lived in makeshift housing on work sites. They also built shantytown communities like Fontainhas, where Costa made some of his earlier films like Colossal Youth. There are a number of themes that run throughout his films about the Cape Verdean community in Portugal. One of the most profound is the pain of separation felt by those who migrate from their homeland and leave loved ones behind. A pain sometimes eased by photographs and letters sent back and forth, but as the years pass and as letters became more infrequent and photographs fade, families become a memory and the sense of loss becomes a permanent mourning. Other family formations emerge in Lisbon as a younger generation is born. Language is another theme that conflates with the motifs of separation and loss. Migrants coming to Lisbon spoke a Portuguese-based Creole used throughout the archipelago, whose official language was and continues to be Portuguese. In time, migrant workers adopted Portuguese as their first language, while Creole became the second language. This was especially true for the younger generation. Several of Costa's characters speak Creole, which required subtitles even for Portuguese-speaking audiences. One of the main differences between Vitalina Varela and Costa's larger oeuvre is the focus he gives to those, mostly women, left behind. In this case, the woman is Vitalina Varela, who remained in Cape Verde after her husband migrated and was for many years a widow of the living. This is an expression used for women whose husbands often never return. After learning of her husband's death, she arrives in Lisbon to attend his funeral. Without family or friends, and speaking a language different from Portuguese, she enters a foreign land. Costa captures the somber atmosphere of a community living on the edge and the struggle of one woman to navigate and overcome the darkness. Now that's my comment about the film, my introduction to the film. I have a second part for my introduction, and I will explain what this is about. When John invited me to introduce the film, I got in touch with Pedro Costa and asked him if he might write a few lines, possibly about the time he spent in Indiana. He also knew that this was, alas, John's last semester as the director of our cinema. At the time, he was in Amsterdam. He wrote me back and said, I'm in Amsterdam for the premiere of Vitalina Varela, but as soon as I get back to Lisbon, I will write to you. And he did. And what I'm going to read to you now is what Pedro wrote. This is my translation. He wrote to me in Portuguese. And this is what he says. In 2011, I showed almost all my films in Bloomington at the Indiana University Cinema. Those were magnificent, but all too short days in October that offered me the chance to re-encounter a writer friend whom I much admire, Jonathan Rosenbaum, a first encounter with another writer whom I already admired, James Naramore, and still another with a writer whom I have since come to admire, Darlene Sadlier, to whom I owe at least half the work that took me to Indiana. The other half I owe to John Vickers, whose efforts had already taken me to the Browning Cinema at Notre Dame. He was not only tireless in the production and great care he put into all the many details of my visit in Indiana. His enthusiasm extended into the darkness of the cinema as the films were screened. I remember John's intense and sparkling eyes on those afternoons and evenings in Bloomington. Here from Lisbon, I send him a warm emotional embrace and dedicate the screening of Vitalina Varela to him. Excellent projection, John.
Very humbling, and well, thank you for reading that, Darlene, and I look forward to our conversation afterwards. This isn't the IU Cinema projection tonight, but I think you'll be pleased with the HD that comes across on your device. So thank you all in the audience for joining us for this introduction, and please come back if you can for the conversation with Darlene and I, and participate in that if you're willing. At this time or some other time this weekend, please access the link to our virtual screening room with Grasshopper Films, and we hope that you enjoy Pedro Costa's beautiful and haunting Vitalina Varela. On behalf of all of us here at IU Cinema, stay healthy, positive, and well, and offer support to others where you can. And we hope to see you later on tonight. Thanks again. Thank you, Darlene. Welcome back to IU Cinema's virtual screening room. I'm hoping everyone can hear me. Okay, great. If you missed the introduction, my name is John Vickers, the founding director of IU Cinema, and we have with us Darlene Sadlier, who's a professor emerita in Spanish and Portuguese at Indiana University. Thanks for being back with us, Darlene. First off, I'll make a few comments and then we'll dig into conversation. But I love the aesthetics of this film. I love the aesthetic of all of his films, but this one for me, I think, is the most striking so far. And just the use of his lighting, the color, the composition of the shots. We were speaking earlier, I think, so many frames in this film could be a Baroque painting, and it's just so beautifully done. And I guess one of the first questions that I would have, if you think you might be able to answer, and for the audience out there, of course, Darlene's not the filmmaker, so we're limited on what we can, you know, ask and answer. But do you know where he gets his inspiration for his aesthetics for his films?
You know, he has, he will talk a lot about different influences. And so he's you know, he's very much interested in noir. So that has some of, you know, the black and white noir, although his films are beautiful, they're color films, and it's hard to imagine him doing a black and white film. But I think someone like Jacques Tourneur was extremely important for him. And in fact, he was, I think, really the inspiration for Costa to go down to Cape Verde to make a film, which was supposed to be some kind of version of I Walk with a Zombie. And I'm kind of segueing away from your aesthetic question, but I'd like to talk about style. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about that film, because that film really is what was the springboard for his many other films about Cape Verde and the migrant community. Because when he came back from making the film in Cape Verde, he brought lots of letters and things, and got introduced to the community there. And that was the beginning of a whole new aspect of his career.
Yeah, I was going to ask that question. And you know, he's dedicated pretty much his, at least the latter part of his career, to, you know, telling the stories of these Cape Verdean immigrants to Lisbon, outside of Lisbon, I guess. Fontenhaus is that the name of it?
Uh-huh.
Okay, thank you.
No.
But he's really, I mean, he's dedicated, I don't know, the last 5 or 6 or 7 films to, you know, people in these communities. And even much more than that, I've read that, you know, even while he's shooting, they're out in the community doing work, and they're trying to do good in the community to uplift the people there. Did he just fall in love with him when he was in Cape Verde on that first trip?
Yeah, I mean, I've never talked to him about, you know, how anything beyond pretty much his films. But I think, you know, there was just an amazing, I don't know, emotional attachment that he had with Cape Verde and with the community there. So when he comes back, he comes into the migrant community, which is not a community that's really all that open. So it was because he was bringing back letters from wives and from children to the probably mostly male migrant community that he got an entree.
Yeah, and I think if I remember right, he lives within that community. Is that correct, or?
That I'm not sure. I know his studio outside. It's in a main part of Lisbon. I know he spends a lot of time there.
Okay. You talked in your introduction about this woman stepping out of darkness, and darkness plays a major role in this film, of course. In fact, I don't know if we see much light other than the beautiful shafts of light that he skillfully puts in place, you know, for its photography. But you know, we're in the dark most of the film, and does darkness play a part in all of his work? I don't remember it as strongly. Well, I do remember it in Horse Money being very strong in other films, yeah. But this maybe his darkest film. Do you have any comments or thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about the whole idea of darkness. It's there's a you know, she even comments, Vitalina Varela even comments at one time that she says that you know, the house has, he made a house and it doesn't have hardly any windows. The sort of almost rabbit warren look like community itself is very dark, you know. but I also think darkness has to do with something about a kind of, going into the mind and into the memory, so I think it has a kind of physical significance as well as a emotional or, let's say, mental significance. I think it's this most beautiful film for me anyway.
Yeah.
But talking about darkness, the darkness also plays very well with those moments of color in the film. He has extraordinary. If you saw House of Lava, it's called Down to Earth. I think that's the English title. He starts using red, the color red. And little by little in each of his films, the red becomes more and more predominant. If you look at this film, you will see in so many of the scenes, like maybe a red coffee can or a red coffee cup or something. For example, the wall in one of the rooms is exposed brick. There's a little square, it almost looks like a painting or something. You don't know what it is, but it's exposed red brick. So, the play of dark and color is just extraordinary.
Yeah, I was tempted to try to find a way to watch clips of this or parts of this in black and white, because I wanted to see if for me, there's a lot of noir, photography or lighting in the film, but it would also take away from the film so much because of, like you had mentioned, his use of color and lighting that color in such a precise way. It's so striking. So there's a lot of religious iconography in the film, and not only things like altars and confessionals and crosses, cross with a necklace on the ground and things like that, but there's also, beautifully shot telephone poles that look like crosses, and they're lit, strikingly. But I don't remember in Costa's other films religion playing a part. Do you know? Can you speak to that?
I think you're right. I think this is the first film, I believe, where he really is focusing on the faith of the migrant. Vitalina Varela is, she's a Catholic, of course, Cape Verde as well as Portugal, Catholic countries. And I think that was a real step, something quite new for Costa to do. What's wonderful is he has he has the ensemble figures that include Ventura, who plays the priest in this particular film, and he just does such an amazing job. The priest who has, in a sense, lost his faith, who there's an incident that Vitalina describes, where he refuses to give baptism to a group of people, and then they are killed, and his, basically a kind of fall from grace in some ways. It's always interesting to think about the idea of falling. So many of Costa's films have people falling down, and you wonder what that's all about. It has to do with sometimes it has to do with someone in a reverie and they fall down. Sometimes it's a physical situation. Ventura is obviously in the film and in, I think, real life, frailer than he has been. But he does the wonderful mass, the saying of the mass in this incredible church, that was discovered by chance. It is an actual church.
Speaking of Ventura, he's playing a priest, and typically in the other films, he's playing himself, even though he's still Ventura in this film. And so Costa uses all or pretty much all non-actors in his films, and he's sharing parts of their stories in their characters. is this a departure for him to use Ventura in this way in this film?
I think it is. I mean, normally, well, I think there are certain things that continue with the character, with Ventura. You know, for example, in this film, as in other films, he roams a lot. You see him roaming the alleys and the back ways, and being contemplative. So that's, I think that there are similarities in some regard, but yeah, this is a departure. I would also say that I think Ventura now considers himself an actor. So he's and there, I read some interview someplace, and he was just saying how good he thought Vitalina did, as if he's a professional commenting on her acting skills. She's wonderful.
I'll ask maybe one more question, and then we'll see if the audience wants to chime in with questions. So audience members, at this point, if you wanted to type in any questions, we'll curate and we'll see what comes forward, and we'll try to get questions answered. So Costa, as far as finding his stories, he does, of course, write, and he crafts these stories, but many of the stories he's telling from the memories and the lives of the actors or non-actors that he's placing in them. And this story, in many ways, is Vitalina's story. Can you talk about, and I don't know if you have insight into how he does find these stories and how he shapes these stories?
My sense is, and once again, I've never had a conversation with him about this, but my sense is that, he listens very well. And I think that is one of the keys to his success. And obviously this is her story, but obviously it is refashioned. No, it is reshaped.
Sure.
But I think also you're talking about a culture that has a wonderful oral tradition, so that people tell stories, and their stories have to do with their lives. So I think he's just, he has been able to absorb that, and I think he always gives credit to for example, Vitalina Varela, that it's her story as much as it is his film. So.
Yeah, that's great. Sorry, for the audience out there as well, I don't think I was clear. If you're new to Zoom, you have to click into the Q&A and type your questions into there. So if you are interested in asking a question that perhaps Darlene or myself can answer. So I've read that, I know that Pedro Costa is very much a cinephile, and he has many, many references. But in this film, one of the references, and somebody that he was thinking about when making Vitalina Varela, is Mikio Naruse, the Japanese director, who really championed women's stories and perspectives. And can you see other influences in this film?
Well, I still see Tourneur. I think there's always something of Tourneur in the film, and in fact, there's a wonderful shot inside Vitalina's house, and you have several men. It's once again a kind of still life. Several men standing. They're standing in the dark, and there's no conversation going on or anything. And it is sort of like I Walk with the Zombie. There's certainly similarities between certain shots. I think he would also say that Rausch was important for him. And I think he mentioned at some point Chris Marker, Sans Soleil. And there's no question. I mean, he always mentions people like John Ford. So I think there's such a range of influences. Straub and Huyer, he makes a film about them. So I think he's a cinephile. And
right. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned John Ford, because he has talked about being a formalist in many ways, even though he doesn't have the budget or the crews as a Hollywood director. One thing that there's a point where Ventura calls Vitalina a mirror of patience, and I think that's also a reflection on Costa himself, because I've read where there's one shot, there's a 4 minutes monologue that they took 2 weeks to film, and so he's willing to put the time in to get things exactly the way he wants. And did you have any conversations with him about his process, or about when he thinks he's finished with the shot, or the precision?
Well, I don't think I've ever talked to him about that in particular, although I know that he, after making I call it House of Lava, but I think the English is Down to Earth. It's in Portuguese, it's Casa de Lava. And when he started making the films in the migrant communities in and around Lisbon, it was even, I think I remember it was Vanda, who's the protagonist in Vanda's room, said, you've got all this big equipment and lots of people, and this is a really intrusion in this neighborhood. So he really cut down his crew and uses a very, digital camera, maybe a tripod. He's got a wonderful cinematographer, Leonardo Simões. I mean, this guy is great. And it's hard to imagine how he manages with this lighting that he gets in this film. I know that in some films he's used reflectors. Here he seems to be using what he calls parallel beams, or he shoots, the light shoots into a mirror, and so you get a kind of indirect, and you also have, I guess they call it source lighting, which means, let's say a window is open and you get the lighting from that. So yeah. I don't know if I went off your question, but I just think the lighting is so amazing in the film.
No question. And not only the shafts of light, but the depth within the darkness is pretty incredible. So we do have a question from Barbara, who asks, the final scene is the only one with full sunlight. Can you comment on this decision to end the film in this way? I have some thoughts, but if you want to go first, or I'll go.
Yeah, I think, there are moments in the film when you do, it's interesting. There's so much darkness that when you do get a shot, for example, a door that opens just a crack and it's light outside, it's an amazing moment. I think the ending is a very interesting ending. It may be a little oblique. I thought it was, I had to think about it and actually looked at it a couple times. But I think, there's a sense of, for example, the next to the last shot where she's in her bed and she hears people up on the roof. And earlier in the film, one of the community members, one of the men, says to her, "We will fix your roof." And so she wakes up and she hears the noise, and the next shot is the men up on the roof, on the tile roof, fixing the roof. And that's in brilliant sunlight. So you have a sense that the community is coming to help her out in some way, which isn't necessarily the feeling you have during the film. And then, of course, the very last shot is a memory shot. Her and a child up on, the scene is Cape Verde or something similar to Cape Verde. So there's a sense of a building or construction. I think it's a very hopeful ending.
Yeah, I do as well. The read that I had on the coming into light, and I don't know if it's a good read or not, but it seems as though we come into light at, is it Mariana's funeral? Is it Mariana's?
Marina.
Okay. Marina's funeral. And for me, that maybe also then opened up Vitalina, and potentially in thinking that, you know, her life isn't the only one in darkness. And, you know, maybe there's some universality of death. And, you know, this is all part of the cycle. And, you know, maybe that made her realize that, you know, everyone has this kind of pain in their lives. And so it's time to move on. And again, that's just my simple read. But anyway, but I do think it's helpful.
I like the the cemetery scene at the end, because you get the first shot of them coming down the sort of street, very dark, and you see the crosses, you know, the cemetery is over there. And you have the joining of hands of Ventura and Vitalina, a sort of, once again, two people who in many ways have suffered loss, perhaps of different kinds, and coming together and standing over graves. Yeah.
There's another question, an anonymous question that asks, why did he decide to name the film Vitalina Varela? And are there layers of meaning there?
Well, it's her story, and he's giving her full credit. It's her name, her real name, talking about the actor's name. And I have to say, I think it's very interesting that many of his main characters, their names start with V. There's Vanda and there's Ventura, and now we have Vitalina Varela. And it's such a great name, makes such a great title.
Is this the first film where he's used a woman as the main protagonist? Besides, I mean, I guess Vanda's Room could be that, but it seems as though, you know, it seems as though this is the first prominent, other than Vanda's Room, and that's a interesting, different type of film, I guess. Are there other earlier films where he champions a woman's story?
Well, in House of Lava or Down to Earth, it's, you know, the main protagonist is a woman, but she's Portuguese. She's the one that takes the Cape Verdean, who he falls. Here we have a falls off a building, supposedly, and thinking about his homeland. But she's not Cape Verdean. I think what's interesting about Vitalina Varela is that it in some ways, it's a big piece of the puzzle that's been left out. It is the story of the person left behind. We're always hearing about them, but normally through the male migrant community. But here she comes, you know, I love the scene, her coming off the airplane. It's just amazing, no? Basically it's her feet, you know, and droplets of water, which you can interpret that in any way you want, I guess. But it sort of fills a gap in his narrative about migrant community.
We'll take one or two more questions, and there's one here from Amina. She commented on the minimal dialogue. It's often in whispers and monologue, except for the scenes between Vitalina and the priest in the church. The viewer has to pay a lot of attention to silence and what is not said, definitely. I was wondering, what did you think about the combination of whispers and silences, especially in relation to the themes of loss and darkness?
That's such a great question. Once again, for me, the whispering it puts you, it's almost as if you're in a different world where people are many times afraid to share thoughts or feelings. There's also, I think that's a really good point. In fact, it's so low that it's sometimes even hard to hear what they're saying in Portuguese. Obviously, we have the English subtitles, but it's very hard to hear what they're saying in Creole or Portuguese. There's this, it sort of makes it's a mysterious world in some ways. I think the other thing about, and it's a lot of silence. I think that's an important point. But at the same time, because one has to think about what silence is, there's always background noise. It could be a television playing. It could be voices of other people. You don't hear necessarily what they're saying, but you hear voices. That has a lot to do with the closeness of people living together. You know, I mean, you can hear your neighbor, you can hear, you know, people in the bar, or so there's all kinds of levels. Even though it seems very silent, there's all kinds of levels of noise going on at the same time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, I mean, those are all the questions we have. And is there anything else you might want to comment on the film? I mean, I think this is a pretty extraordinary piece of work.
Yeah, I have to, there are a couple things, if I may. It has to do with, you know, we're in a very poor community, and and yet you have these amazing images of, for example, her front door that's blue, that has rust spots on it and other marks. And sometimes it almost looks like an abstract painting. It's the palette is so amazing. You know, he really just has such an eye for things like that. And of course, some things are, let's say, constructed, but I think that's one of the really powerful aspects of the film, for me anyway. And of course, it's a very largely still film. I mean, the camera doesn't move around a lot. It's pretty stationary. And now I'm going to go back to the question that you asked me before about takes. I think he says in some place he makes 30 takes sometimes to get the image that he wants. And, you know, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
He's a perfectionist, no? He
is. I'm glad he's making films. I don't know how he affords to do it and how he finds his funding, but I'm glad that there are artists out there like this that put this kind of effort and intention, you know, into their work.
Me too. I mean, he has drawn attention to a community that was basically, in many ways, invisible, and has become visible worldwide. And he's done it in an amazingly beautiful way. So let's hope he continues to do his good work. Yes,
same. Well, thank you for being part of this conversation. Thank you to the audience members who were part of this as well, and supporting IU Cinema. And have a great night, and be safe and well. Thanks.
Thanks, John.